Welcome to Zooming In Coronavirus Special. I'm Simone Gao. President Trump is ready to invoke Defense Production Act to expand production of vital hospital equipment. What's the impact of that? Also, the stock market keeps going down. Are we going to see another 2008? I will discuss these questions and much more with Jack Maxey, co-host of War Room Pandemic with Steve Bannon. In my opinion, one of the most diligent observers of the coronavirus pandemic in the country. How are you, Jack?
Doing very well, Simone. Thank you for having me.
Okay, why don't you give us an update of the current coronavirus situation? We're going to talk about President Trump's Defense Production Act, but other than that, what is the big news today?
Well, I think the big news is that we're seeing rapid increase in cases in New York and New York State. These are obviously focusing the whole country's attention on the reality that seems to be upon us. We've been speaking about the math for well over a month, but I think the math is catching up to everybody, and I think that there is nobody who does not doubt that a wave is on its way.
Okay. Let's talk about the Defense Production Act that President Trump is ready to invoke. Here's a little background of that act. So the Defense Production Act is a 1950 wartime law in response to the start of the Korean War. It has three major components. The first authorized the president to require businesses to sign contracts or fulfill orders deemed necessary for national defense. The second authorized the president to establish mechanisms such as regulations, orders, and agencies to allocate materials, services, and facilities to promote national defense. The third section authorized the president to control the civilian economy so that scarce or critical materials necessary to the national defense efforts are available for defense needs. On Wednesday, Defense Secretary Mark Esper said that the Defense Department will make available up to 5 million N95 masks and other personal protective gears from U.S. strategic reserves. So Jack, first of all, how big of an impact will this have?
Well, I think we have to remember that the president invoked this once before last summer in terms of magnets that were necessary for military applications made with rare earth minerals. And we were concerned at that time about the supply chain originating in China, essentially impacting our military's ability to operate. So he's done it this time, and I think it's the correct thing to do. And I don't think it's as overly dramatic as some want to make it sound. Really what it does is it makes the government have first rights to the production of U.S. manufacturing. So if you have a mask manufacturer, the government can go to you and say, look, produce as many as you can, X, Y, Z. You deliver to us first, sort of in a similar way to what the Chinese government did when they went in and they took down the production of 3M for, say, N95 masks. It's essentially to focus the nation's industrial capacity upon those things necessary for us to defeat this unseen enemy that President Trump is now calling it the virus.
All right. So will this actually authorize the U.S. government to order the production of the pharmaceutical products back to the U.S. from China?
Well, it was interesting. You had a senator from Missouri earlier today said to any American company that is seeking financial aid from the United States Congress, you better come prepared with a roadmap to how you are bringing back production from overseas to the United States. We are not going to support companies that have been part of the problem. And if you want our support in the future, you essentially have to be part of the solution. So yes, I think this is a vital interest to everybody that we bring production back here. But what this is doing in the immediate near term is focusing those industries that can have an impact to focus all their efforts on what we're trying to do. And a perfect example is a great guy who's been on our show many times. And in fact, I think history will show that he sort of gave the clarion call concerning our lack of supplies. A gentleman named Mike Bowen, who works for a company called America Prestige down in Prestige Ameritech, forgive me, and they run a mask line down in Dallas. Now, 25 years ago, these guys in that single plant produced over 80% of all of the N95 masks for America. As of a month ago, they were producing about 1 million masks a day. I think they've doubled, tripled production to try and meet the needs of that we have now. But in his case, it would mean that the federal government could go to him and say, look, we preempt all your other orders. You need to give all the masks to us so that we can distribute them as needed. And this is just a rational way to sort of focus the supplies to the places where they're most needed. You spoke about the national strategic supply and the Pentagon's decision to give several million masks, N95 masks, and also some ventilators to the civilian hospitals. I think this is a good idea. I would say it's not part of the plan, but we are in a position where plans need to be modified as necessary, and I'm glad to see the president and his team taking every and all necessary steps to make that happen.
Right. I remember Mike Bone said in the War Room episode that one concern he had was during the time of a crisis, everybody went to him and said, produce masks for us. So he ramped up his production. Once the crisis is over, everybody went to China again. So he ended up with this overcapacity of production. So do you think this time would be different? People would not move back to China?
I think everything is going to be different this time. Also, one of the things that really chapped Mike's biscuit and I think made me a little upset too was, and we still don't know who this person is apparently. This tells you the tyranny of these bureaucracies. When the president came into office, he made it clear that anything going into the Defense Department that had anything associated with an individual's kit, so a soldier's rifle, his boots, his shirt, his cap, his belt, his knife, whatever it is, all had to be produced inside America. Well, this was thought to be an amazing thing for a guy like Mike Bowen, right? We produce protective clothing for our military hospital personnel, so it should fall under that thing. Someone, somewhere, changed the criteria and declared these protective clothing to be medical devices rather than protective clothing. And so even during this administration, the VA and the Defense Department continued to buy from big name American companies like 3M from their production plants inside China. So in future, I think it's going to be very clear that all these things are going to have to be produced at home, or they're going to have to be produced in cooperation with our first tier allies who can be trusted and stockpiled accordingly. I don't think that anytime in the next 20 years we're going to be caught flat-footed like we were this time. So complacency is a huge danger. We haven't seen a virus like this since 1918, and 2009 H1N1 out of Mexico should have been a wake-up call. 2003 out of China should have been a wake-up call. But again, those turned out to be not nearly as dramatic and as impactful as this one. And like people do, they went back to their old habits once the storm had passed.
Right. Hopefully this time will be different. So let's talk about the economy. U.S. equities market plunged again at Wednesday's opening after a one-day bounce on Tuesday. So this morning, as soon as the market opened, the Dow dropped 1,000 points, or more than 5%. S&P 500 sank more than 130 points, a more than 5% decline. And the Nasdaq gave up more than 330 points, and more than 4% drop. So the Fed intervention, lowering the interest and injecting liquidity, hasn't seemed to be working. Why is that?
Well, I think you have to realize that the entire world is, in a sense, shut down. We now have 270 million Europeans who are in a state of kind of modified lockdown. So I remember a month and a half ago talking about that in China and thinking, oh my gosh, this is just off the charts. And now Europe is in the same condition. So this is not a situation where I think more liquidity is going to solve the problem. I believe personally that the only way we get this economy back on its feet is to defeat the virus and be able to put people back to work. Now, I think that what you saw with the bounce yesterday in the markets and the several sort of dead cat bounces that we've seen over the last week and a half, I think that what you're seeing right now is that reality is beginning to triumph over optimism, whereas prior to this, it was the triumph of optimism over reality. And the math is starting to sink in. For example, you look at a very large company like Boeing Aircraft. Boeing Aircraft is on its knees right now. Boeing represents, just Boeing, our second largest export for the entire country is Boeing Aircraft, after food and agriculture and products surrounding that. It's even larger than the oil industry in terms of its export value. So this is going to have impacts all across the economy, and I do not think that you are really doing much by throwing more money at it. I think that there can be made promises. I think that we can perhaps purchase some of the commercial paper. But at the end of the day, the only people, I think, if we're going to go to a massive stimulus, who should really be receiving things up front, and the most efficient way, I believe, to do that would be just to send money to the average American family. I'm not going to rely on a Fortune 500 company getting a big bonus and then, trickling it down to their employees. To me, I think in this situation, that's not fair.
Right. So you think the central bank, instead of injecting liquidity to the market, should just give money to the American people?
Well, I think they should do both, but I'm going back to the original question. Is it helping? I think that any rational observer would look at this and say, we've thrown almost $3 trillion at this problem. And the market is today where it was when the president took office. And this is not in any way a criticism of him. This is something that people have to understand. We keep calling this a wartime presidency, or the equivalent of going to war against this unseen enemy, the Wuhan virus. And the reality is, in a war, the only objective is victory. Not everybody comes out of a war unscathed. And I think that we have to just be open to the idea that we're all going to suffer through this together. I think one of the obscene things, every time we have one of these hiccups, the people crying the most are the people on Wall Street and the bankers. Yet they're the architects of this house that is now falling apart before our eyes. And they're also the first ones begging to have us come put out their fire. Listen, I have less empathy for those guys who should have learned. They've had several lessons in just the last 20 years concerning their behavior. I have less empathy for them than some guy who's nailing in roof tiles out in Ohio. So if we are going to play this government come to the rescue, I want the government to come to the rescue of the American people. This is Jack Maxey speaking. I'm not speaking for anyone else.
Okay, I understand that. So, but on the other hand, if the government doesn't help the big companies, do you think we're going to see another 2008?
I think we've already seen another 2008. I said it yesterday. I think we are in full-on global recession. And the people who pretend to be mathematicians all day long while they gamble with their bank's money or their own money or their clients' money seem to be quite vacant in their ability to understand the math of this virus. We are watching it increase exponentially around the world. It is not going to get better. It is going to get worse. And the sooner people acknowledge that, the better off they will be. I can't say this more seriously. Everybody is going to be harmed in some way. And I think that the leaders out there, both politically and economically, who start giving people the hard truth are going to be the ones who come out of this with better reputations. Part of the problem, let's be very serious about this, everybody from the mavens of Wall Street to many of the Western leaders to even the leaders of China have tried to make this seem as if, the economy is going to be rosy. It's not going to be rosy. And everybody needs to grasp that. along with many other things, are not going to be rosy. We are in uncharted territory right now, and the normal tricks that we have to try and make little painful episodes go away, or little errors and communal errors in judgment on the part of our Wall Street establishment, are not going to work this time, because this isn't a crisis of liquidity. This is a crisis of China is offline. That's 40% of the global goods in the world are now in some part either not being produced or being produced at levels that are severely reduced. The same thing that we're seeing in terms of shortages of PPEs and masks and everything else. 85% of children's toys are produced in China. It's just that no one dies when they can't get a new Barbie, and they do die when they can't get a ventilator. So we're seeing this reduction in economic activity all across the world, and I think it's sort of painful to watch everybody focus on the stock market, for me, when we realize that there is so much human tragedy that we are witnessing right now and will continue to witness for some months.
Right. I think this coronavirus is really a wake-up call to the Chinese Communist Party. And one more thing unusual about the stock market is that usually when the market plunges, the price of the precious metal goes up. This time that didn't happen. The price for gold and silver go down as well. Why is that?
Well, there's an old saw that they have on Wall Street that when things go bad, you don't sell what you want to sell, you sell what you can sell. And we're seeing this in the bond market. We're seeing this in the precious metals market. In a situation like this, you would think that gold would go through the roof, but gold has actually lost $200. It's down from $1,700, I think, a week ago to roughly around $1,500 today, last time I looked at it. That's a significant drop. And it goes in the face of what we would expect in an orderly kind of market disruption that had a traditional trajectory. And I think right now what you're seeing is that everybody is scrambling for whatever cash they can get their hands on. Even though the world has, almost nil interest rates, what that has done is it's created massive amounts of malinvestments, massive amounts of leverage, right? If money's free, why don't I just double down on my stock market investments? Makes sense, right? It's been going up 15% every year, blah, blah, blah. And so everybody from the hedge fund geniuses to mom and pops have been equal geniuses over the last 3 years because there has been no downside. If money is free, there's no penalty for gambling, right? So I think everybody has to readjust. If you think about it, we've had 3,000 years of save money, save gold, put it under your fire pit, under a brick in your fireplace, whatever. And now for the first time in history, we see that even that's not good advice because we're in that much of a chaotic position right now. And the chaos is caused by the virus, and it's caused by our inability as human beings to absorb the information that is before us, the mathematics that are before us that show us the exponential growth of this virus. And yet we want to live in denial because we wish for a different outcome. I think that everybody has to be prepared to ride the wave. There's no other choice. The priority for all the nations of the earth, it seems to me, should be to save lives and end the virus, and the rest of it will fall back into place. And if we've got good enough institutions, we've got a strong enough constitution, it will fall back into place. I think that we tend to take the things that are occurring to us right now and make them bigger than they are in the history of the world. In the history of the world, this will be a chapter. It will not be the last chapter, and we have to remember that.
Well said, Jack. Thank you. That's it for today's coronavirus special. You are watching Zooming In with Simone Gao. Please also download our podcast and be sure to come back tomorrow.